Welcome to People of Purpose.
People of Purpose.
People of Purpose.
People of Purpose.
People of Purpose is a podcast of inspiring people whose stories help you see things differently, live with intentionality, elevate the way you participate in the world, and take the necessary leaps in your life to seek and find your passions. Come with us and develop the courage to wholeheartedly pursue your purpose and unleash your truest potential. Hello, and welcome to another episode of People of Purpose. Today I'm joined by a visionary thinker who's changing the way we talk about connection in divided environments. Jamye Chapman is here with me. He's the founder of the Inner Peace Foundation and author of Evolve Your We, From Courage to Connection in a Divided World. The work is about shaping a more human-centered, emotionally intelligent approach to leadership and organizational culture, from forgiveness and boundary setting to universal human essence. We're about to dive deep. Jamye, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Tanner. I appreciate it. I know before the call we talked a little bit about names. I should have mentioned that my pronunciation is Jamye. But super happy to be on this show. Super impressed with you and your work, and just the intentionality and the conscientiousness of what you're doing with your podcast. I think we need a lot more of it, and I'm hoping that the podcast gets more and more attention, even more than it already has. I'm just really blessed to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, man. Thank you for showing up. I appreciate that. It's a gift to give your time. Time is a resource that is eventually running out for us, and to spend an hour of our lives together, I don't take it lightly. I really appreciate that.
I love that.
Well, Jamye, what exactly inspired you to create the Inner Peace Foundation? How did this concept of the universal human essence emerge throughout the journey of creating your foundation?
Yeah, so the Inner Peace Foundation really emerged from my personal journey of trying to understand these deep divisions I was seeing throughout my childhood and have experienced throughout my life, but particularly, obviously, in my adolescence. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which has one of the worst socially deprived areas in the country, one of the most violent zip codes in the country, which is the one I grew up in. And as a young Black man, I kind of witnessed firsthand how the context of my social status, or the social construct that I was born into, really shapes how people perceive inadequacy and also value in other people. And the concept of universal human essence really came from observing that beneath all of that, all of the discrimination and the quote unquote racism and this systemic kind of injustices that I saw and still continue to see, beneath all that, I knew and felt like that there's still something really fundamental that connects us irregardless of those things, which are our capacity for empathy, creativity, and our ability to use reason and logic to kind of overcome some of the corruption of our better nature. And I call those things our human superpowers. And I kind of noticed how even in the most divided environments, when people connect on a human level, transformation happens. And it does, and it happens organically, and it happens authentically, and it happens with true empathy and love and acceptance. And one of the things that really cemented that for me, which at the time I knew it was an important time of my life, but it took me years to really reflect on it. I was in high school, and I went to a high school that was predominantly folks who didn't look like me. We were all really good friends. So my classmates, I still consider them brothers to this day. But there was a moment where there was a racially charged incident. One of my friends called another of my friends, who happened to be who happened to look like me, the N word. And like this, I remember thinking to myself, I was probably like 14 or 15. I remember thinking to myself, like, I could be really angry right now, or I could try to figure out, because the person that caused the trauma was actually my friend. So I could either try to be really angry and upset and assert my masculinity and do all the things, or try to dig deep and figure out what the root of that is. And so my friends came running to, I lived in a dorm, and my friends came running into the room like, Jamye, be calm. They told me what happened, and I walked down to our student union and saw my friend who had been traumatized crying, and I saw my other friend there. Right, they were sitting together, and so, long story short, we had a conversation about, not about what necessarily happened, but about what exists between all three of us, like what our connection was before that event. And that is the most important thing that we need to keep hold of and really focus on, because what we do in life, and I say it this often, like the beliefs and the behaviors that we have, oftentimes we come into those beliefs and behaviors honestly, right? Like people teach us, we're taught certain things by our echo chambers and by the people around us, and we develop our sense of self really through programming and conditioning from societal structures. And in that moment, it really showed me that when we can intervene, um, we can create space for genuine connection, and that's really how the foundation of the Inner Peace Foundation was built, on that premise that if we recognize our universal human essence, we can really bridge divides that seem insurmountable.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, deep down, we all have hearts, and we all have like love, a capacity to love and choose forgiveness. Um, yeah, and like what we give is what we get back. So it's like if we want to feel peace, let's give it first. Let's not expect someone to give it to us before we necessarily lead with it.
Totally agree. And it's hard, right? For some people in our society to lead with grace and to lead with forgiveness. And I know we're going to talk about that later, but when you have justified anger, in a manner of speaking, it's hard to like put that off to the side and really focus on love.
That's true. So I guess as this relates to, you do a lot of work in the professional environment, which I think before the call we were kind of talking about the importance in America achieving this level of empathy. A lot of America is in some sort of professional, fast-paced, work-dominant identity. And then we naturally have these divisions and this individuality. We're also this incredibly diverse country. How do we get connected in these divided environments? Why do you think we're first disconnected in the way we are, and then how can we heal those disconnections?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on this, right? Like our culture in America is capitalistic. It's kind of based on this sense of productivity and always achieving and always accumulating. And I think what happens is we, well, I'm going to talk about two disconnects because there's a couple things at play. One is the competition. So there's a competition factor where we sometimes operate in America from a zero sum perspective, where we think if if um, if there is a finite set of resources, um, if I don't get it, somebody else will, or if I get it, then the person, the other people won't. But then I will have secured, in some sense, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I would have secured that foundation level of Maslow's hierarchy need of like my basic security, provisions, shelter, et cetera, et cetera. And so like that's one thing that's at play. And then you have like our societal contexts where you have groups of people who have been historically marginalized and systemically marginalized, not from just like a very uh, surface level systemic nature, but it's actually been embedded into institutions from the very beginnings of our country and then onwards. And I don't want to like spout like all the various examples. I'm sure folks are aware of what I'm talking about, things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Civil War, et cetera, right? There's plenty of examples of that. And so I think first, the way that we get around that is recognizing that when we help others, we actually help ourselves. So if in my book I talk about this idea of cooperation versus uh, competition, and if you think about it, like over throughout history, whenever different cultures or different societal contexts kind of interact, but they interact on this basis of like, hey, we're going to be cooperative. So if you think about trade agreements, not now, but if you think about like several hundred years ago, and maybe even millennia ago, when different countries and regions of the world would kind of interact, like they would set up these trade agreements, but they wouldn't just trade like goods. They would trade ideas, they would trade knowledge, they would trade specializations, etc. And that would like enhance both of those cultures, right? And I think we've kind of moved away from that, at least in America, where we are focused a lot more on competition, and we've lost like this the knowledge that when you invite me to your podcast and I speak on your podcast, we're working to enhance both of our objectives, both of our goals, and in doing so, right, we can help a lot more people versus if you just had a podcast all by your own and you're very intelligent and very insightful. But it helps to have different perspectives and different understandings about the world and ourselves and how we interact with that. And so that's what I think we have to get back to that. And then once we do that, we can kind of have this space or this foundation or this basis for healing and then moving forward.
Yeah, I love that. I completely agree. Yeah, the cooperation versus competition is absolutely huge, especially in the world of business. Like everything is about essentially what gets created. I run a startup company, and we're constantly forging new strategic partnerships to create new value. It's that like 1+1 = more than just two.
Absolutely.
There's a synergy that comes from it.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to write about these in particular? Like, why not just keep them to yourself? Like, why did you feel the need to put it down in the book?
Well, part of it was like I kept feeling like I had something to say, and people weren't when I would try to articulate it. Um, all of the concepts and like theory and the methodology, I won't say it's complex, but it takes time and space to really think through it. And I said, you know what? I just need to write this out. Even if no one ever reads the book, I need to get it out of my head. Because also in some ways, I think I was still trying to, and am still trying. But in the process of writing the book, I was still trying to figure out exactly what it is that I was thinking. And so, yeah, that was like the first part. Like, I need to get this out, but also knew or felt like I knew and believed that it could be helpful for other people to kind of give themselves permission to write, like, um, be vulnerable be honest and be open with themselves. And that's really what I think the heart of the book is about, is like, it's we do a lot of blaming of ourselves, or at least I do, but I feel like there's a lot of blame and consternation that we have about how we interact, but sometimes we don't exactly know how to like forgive ourselves from that, and have some explanatory power where we can understand, like, yes, I may believe this thing right now and it may be wrong, but let me understand where that comes from, and how do I go about like seeking new perspectives, seeking new opinions or ideas to cultivate like a new understanding for myself that I'm comfortable with. And I think that's really some of the hope the book gives folks who read it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, you talk a lot about creativity in the
Hmm.
transformation process. How does creativity play a role more so than just like innovating the strategy of a company, but in healing the disconnection within teams? How can
Mm.
leaders tap into creativity to accomplish that transformation at the team level?
Yeah, I love the question. I've done a couple I've had a couple conversations and talks about the book, and this is one thing that rarely comes up. So I really love that you asked this. So as I mentioned, right, like creativity is one of those superpowers. It's third on my list, but it's not, definitely not the least impactful. And I see creativity alongside reason and empathy as a superpower, because it's what allows us to envision possibilities beyond our current reality. So
Hmm.
I say a lot of times, like, there we know what conviction looks like, right? That's something that we've studied, researched, come to believe. Our experiences have shown us, we've grappled onto these opinions and we're convicted about them. And in order to change those convictions, in order to like be open and vulnerable to being wrong about our convictions, we have to envision like something, not necessarily greater, but something evolving that can add to that, to enhance our ability to kind of see beyond what our current reality is. And when teams are divided, they often get stuck in like rigid thinking patterns based on like their convictions and things that they've learned and developed over time. But what happens is that actually reinforces separation, and creativity disrupts those patterns, because it invites us into like this state of curiosity and playfulness, right? Like when we create together, if you think about like kids that are playing with like blocks or like those magnet architectural toys, they don't have like designs that they're looking at. They don't have blueprints that have already been decided and studied, and right, they're just figuring it out. And so creativity allows us to like momentarily suspend our preconceptions and then connect through the universal language of like making something new. um, and I think the way leaders can leverage creativity, to your question, is first they can model it, right? So creating a space where shared experiences transcend hierarchies and like um, organizational structures, right? So you should be able to have, if we're speaking hierarchical, the person on that lowest rung should be able to feel safe enough to share their experience, share their knowledge, and understand and know that that is going to contribute to the overall uh, improvement and performance of your organization. Second, I think using like different methods to communicate complex emotions that sometimes we don't have the right words for. So let me give you an example about that. I was in a group, and it was being facilitated by this gentleman who I admire a lot, and we were having a conversation about how something um, made me feel, right? And he said the question was something like, okay, Jamye, well, when do you come into these spaces and you feel like your voice isn't being heard, how does that make you feel? And I said, well, I feel angry about that. And he said, no, you actually, you're hurt. You feel hurt. And when I
Mm,
stopped to think about it, that was the true emotion. I wasn't really angry. I felt hurt. And so like being able to, like, I think you mentioned this, like have the space and time to process how we feel, what our complex emotions are, and use that constructively versus like going immediately to what our mind might be telling us is very crucial. And then on a very like tactical level, encouraging metaphorical thinking to help teams see challenges from new perspectives. Leaders can also like design physical spaces differently that inspire collaboration. Um, and then one of the things that I think is super important is like this art of storytelling and being able to incorporate storytelling practices that kind of honor diverse experiences, um, but also help propel organizations forward or into new ways of thinking or into new ways of understanding, and really having like the space for people to be able to say, the I feel this way or I think this way, not just because of my academic studies, but I was at I don't want to name any brands, but I was at the Tanner Lodge and Craft, and they really had a space that was accessible. Right, they had ramps, and they had interpreters and a ASL signed person in physically in their store to like make sure that they were incorporating all of these the aspects of identity and how people are people's level of ability and behavior. But anyway, like incorporating storytelling practices is really important because it helps people share ideas and gives like this foundational approach to where those ideas come from based on their social context. And I think that's super important.
yeah. Do you have a thinker or person in the storytelling space that I should follow?
Not off the top of my head, but I can definitely, we can follow up, and I can reach back out to you with some ideas on that.
Cool. Yeah, because that's been a pattern in my life the last couple of weeks. Is just um, as a leader, find a way to tell a compelling story where everyone is in the hero role, everyone's in cooperation with each other, we're unified as a result of it, and it
Mm,
doesn't necessarily matter what our circumstances are now. We're going here.
mm,
That's such a superpower to bring to team transformation.
absolutely. And you setting that vision, right? Because storytelling is, I think, is part of visioning, and like you setting that
Mm,
vision and getting people coalesced around it, um, and authentically, right? Because it's not coming from a spreadsheet, it's not coming from a PowerPoint, it's coming from your heart. And to my earlier point, like we are connected at that level, and you being able to like get your folks there to that heart level, that creates intrinsic motivation, right? Versus some other things we might see out there, like, okay, sell 20 cars in a month and that's your metric for its value. And now I'm just chasing this metric, but I'm not really sure why I'm doing it.
mm, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And then you do talk about metrics and how traditional metrics, they tend to not really capture the health of an organization.
Mm,
What are some overlooked human metrics that we should start tracking if we want deeper connection?
great question. You hit it on the head. I think first of all, relationships, and you know this, I know, and a lot of your listeners probably know this also, but relationships are the key to any business, both internally and externally. But we don't quite know And sometimes, to be honest, Tanner, I think some organizations don't really feel comfortable talking about human metrics because it's just something I think we've been taught, like we said, where folks are not attuned there. They're not really attuned to the relational space. They're attuned to the accumulation and the productivity space. But anyway, to your point or to your question, one is psychological safety. That's a metric that organizations should definitely track. There's another term that people use: emotional safety, emotional intelligence, et cetera. But psychological safety to me really speaks to this idea that I can be me and not have this fear of judgment around me. Do people feel like they can speak up without like fear of punishment or humiliation? You know what I mean? And then there's this metric that I call explanatory power, and that is how well do your team members understand perspectives different than their own? Can they articulate why someone might see a situation differently? This other one, which I think, again, I keep mentioning it, this forgiveness capacity. How quickly do your teams recover from conflict? Do people hold grudges or move forward with new understanding? Boundary health. Are people able to set and respect boundaries? Do they feel empowered to communicate their needs? Belonging. People feel like they're supposed to work without having to compartmentalize important aspects of their identity. So you might have heard like things like code switching or folks in the LGBTQIA plus community acting in ways that are more straight centered, et cetera. And then the final kind of metric I think that is important, not the final, I'm sure that there's more folks can come up with, but is this perspective of neutrality. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but that's where, that's where you're analyzing and tracking how folks are, or if they are suspending judgment and approaching differences with curiosity rather than defensiveness. And I will say, right, like I said this before, like organizations are not used to doing this. And one of the ways that you can do this is when you meet as a team, you can have on a rotating basis, however you want to do it. I have tools for these things, but you have a person whose role in your meeting is just observation, and they're tracking these human metrics as the meeting is occurring, and then afterward you get those quantitative human metrics, and then you can meet with your leadership team and meet with your staff and determine, right, like how you want to move forward or transition or change the way that you interact and behave as an organization in terms of your relationships. You can build plans from those types of that type of tracking.
Yeah, man, I love it. That's cool. And how have you found that organizations are being receptive to adding these metrics to their already 28 metrics that are tracking for performance? How does that go in terms of implementation?
So very good question. I think there's a couple things. I think first is particularly now, like a lot of our metrics, and I'm talking about the organizational like outcome metrics in terms of like business numbers, the traditional business metrics that we all use and rely on. Like, I think organizations first need to tap into the ability of technology to in system operational management, where those things just take time to set up at first, but there's so much technology out there that can generate those things on a rolling basis for you, as long as you're inputting all of those quantitative metrics that should be captured in some sort of CRM or some spreadsheet or something that already exists, right? So right now, organizations have the ability to offload a lot of that manual entry and quantitative analysis to technology. And so like that's the first thing I try to help organizations understand systemically, like how can you not do things that technology can do for you. And then to your question, which is a great one, having the conversation about with this new found like resource of time, how can you incorporate these more human-centered metrics into your organization and really evolve your we as an organization? And I found that folks are at first are really uncomfortable with that. Like I said, like most people haven't really tapped into that individual awareness space yet, particularly a lot of the leaders that I talk to. And not just that, their organization hasn't been prepped to have those conversations, because a lot of the time they can be challenging. You know, people are opening up, being vulnerable, they're sharing intimate information, and it's something that you have to take time to do. I wouldn't recommend organizations just take my my human metric system and then just start implementing it. I would recommend that they have a full understanding of the methodology, what it would take to actually get your organization into a space where they're ready to do it. And so I've found that most leaders want like a quick fix, and this is not a quick fix. This is something that you have to be really conscientious and intentional about. And so yeah, there's a process there. It usually takes about 3 to 6 months to get to a place where you're ready to start implementing some of these tools.
Yeah. And then you also teach about forgiveness in the workplace. That's an interesting concept. I understand forgiveness in marriage and in friendship and stuff, but in the workplace, I think certain people don't necessarily view the intimacy of their relationship as maybe as important as in these more personal relationships. How do you teach about forgiveness in the workplace and excusing harm? Especially in a society right now where people get very quickly triggered and victimized and judge others. How do we do that?
Yeah. So I think forgiveness, thank you for that question, because it's a good one. I think forgiveness is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of human connection. What I found is most people think of forgiveness as we hear that adage like forgive and forget, which kind of has this connotation that you just move on from something. And I think many people resist forgiveness because of that reason, because they confuse it with like condoning harm or relinquishing accountability. But the way I teach it is like true forgiveness is the decision individually to no longer allow someone's harmful actions to control your internal state. So a lot of times what happens is when we experience trauma, there are a couple of things that happen. Anger is usually the first reaction, hurt, like sadness, and then like bitterness, which is like the antithesis of forgiveness. Bitterness is like this harboring of anger, where it's actually controlling your internal state to the point where your behavior is being controlled by it, right? You're no longer suspending judgment. You are basing your every interaction on this premise of anger and bitterness. And so that is extremely harmful, as you can imagine, to an organization. If you have people in your organization that are just always angry or bitter when they see a certain person or a certain group of people or whatever in your organization. So what I teach is that forgiveness is really a process of healing that benefits um, the forgiver, so the person who has been traumatized, as much, if not more, than the forgiven. So forgiveness says what happened was not okay, and I'm choosing not to carry the burden of bitterness because it limits my own growth. In contrast, right, like excusing harm minimizes the impact and it bypasses like the necessary accountability. So there's a conversation that happens when I'm hurt at work, or when an organ or a person is hurt at work, that should happen, that often doesn't happen, where you ask, right, like, hey, is there a way that we can have a few moments together? I wanted to talk about something that I experienced with you. And we talked about this earlier, Tanner, about like this ability to and often the responsibility of the forgiver to remove their anger and approach with grace and healing. And so you're having this conversation. This is what I experienced. This is how it made me feel. This is why I was hurt by that. And I want to know if there's a way that we can move forward in a more healing space where neither of us are harboring any bitterness or anger about the situation, because I really value you as a coworker. I really value you as a leader, and I want our relationship to work so we can uh, improve and enhance our organization's mission and vision and goals, etc. Right? Like that's the conversation that should happen, that doesn't, and that's what I teach, because it's both about accountability, but it's more so about like that individual who was hurt being able to still, like we talked about, operate in a psychologically safe space, um, uh, and operate in this mode of cooperation versus competition. Because oftentimes when I'm hurt, now it's me against you, and we don't. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it's super good. Yeah, we got to get out of the me versus you dynamic and find a shared purpose.
Yeah.
We're in this together to achieve these things that we all said we care about: the mission, vision, values, essence of the team that we're building right now. And yeah, it's like
Yeah.
I love the nuance you create around excusing harm and bypassing accountability, but still like making this internal decision that I'm
Hmm.
no longer going to let this person's actions affect me. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. There's really three things, right? If I wanted to answer that succinctly, right? One, forgiveness is internal work. Accountability is external, and
yeah,
both of them are necessary, right? Forgiveness. The second thing is like forgiveness is possible when we get explanatory power, which we haven't really talked about yet, but I can talk about it in a minute. Which is understanding or trying to understand why someone acted the way that they did without justifying their actions. And then the third thing is like forgiveness doesn't mean that we resume the relationship without change. That's kind of that conversation I was talking about. What it means is that we're freeing ourselves from the burden of resentment. Uh, and when organizations can understand those distinctions, forgiveness really becomes a powerful tool for healing rather than a way to sweep harm under the rug.
wow, yeah, man, absolutely. Do you want to talk about the explanatory power aspect of that?
Right. So yeah, so explanatory power is conscious, intentional decision to be curious about why a certain behavior or why someone could have acted in the way that they did, but without um, using our preconceived notions about why they would have done that. So really asking curious questions. Uh, I think a lot of us have heard, or maybe a lot of us haven't, but um, there are a few things that remind me of explanatory power. So I used to have road rage quite a bit. Not in like this, I'm running people off the road, but just like, transparently and vulnerably, like, what the F, what are you doing? And get off of the fast lane, blah, blah, blah.
Wow, that's not a
Right.
healthy
Like,
headspace to be hanging out in.
no, not a good headspace to be, but right. But, and then this is earlier in my driving career. Um, right.
Driving career.
It probably still happens every now and then. But anyway, like one thing that stopped that was, I think my mom said when I was a kid, like, maybe this person is kind of swerving in and out because they're going to the hospital, they're taking somebody to the hospital, or they're late for a meeting, or they're whatever, right? Like, and what she was teaching me was trying to get away from like what my first thought was and really understand with explanatory power, like what else could potentially be going on. Therefore, like, suspend it relieves me of that immediate judgment and anger or whatever those emotions were. And once you discover, you know, the why potentially behind an action, that's the space where forgiveness really can take hold, because you're not attaching blame necessarily. You're just really understanding how that person came to be in that situation or how they came to act in that way. And by understanding it, we connect our humanity. So now when I have that understanding, if I'm being honest with myself, I know, had I potentially been in the same situation or had the same upbringing or been around the same people, I could also have enacted those behaviors. And so when you recognize like this connection of a person who has caused harm or caused trauma with your own self-identity, then it's easier to forgive because you know that you also have the capacity for it. And that's something that I think, again, is really misunderstood about forgiveness. Is it actually connects us to the human parts of ourselves that we sometimes dismiss or think, right? Oftentimes we'll see something bad happen and we'll say, oh, I would never do that, or I would never say that about that person. But once you gain explanatory power and you understand how that person came to be who they are, and if you put yourself in that person's shoes and say, hey, if I had their same DNA, their same genes, their same parents, their same upbringing, their same environment, I might do the same thing, because we're all human. And when you
Mhm.
get that, it's very powerful. And it allows you to kind of move in this direction of curiosity and healing and forgiveness that we've been talking about in the last few minutes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then like another important piece to all this is about boundaries. You made
Mm,
the claim that like boundaries actually build better connection. It
mhm.
seems counterintuitive on the surface, but can you unpack that idea for us?
Yeah, I think a lot of people believe boundaries create distance, but I think paradoxically, healthy boundaries are really the foundation of sustainable connection. Um, Without them, relationships can be enmeshed, where people either like lose their individuality or they just become disconnected or disengaged. And they withdraw to protect themselves from exploitation. But if you know, like, where my boundaries are, I'm actually being kind to you if I'm telling you that and articulating that, because now you what's happening is you have the information you need to know to not cause harm. Um, I'm not going to be caused harm, hopefully, because we've shared these boundaries, and we're moving together like with a shared understanding. So that actually, when you have shared understanding, that actually connects people versus creating distance, which I think a lot of people get wrong about boundaries. And we could talk about like there's a whole spectrum of things we could talk about in terms of like people setting boundaries and what's realistic versus what's not realistic. But that's not really what I want to talk about right now. Like I'm just focusing on quote unquote realistic boundaries that people could potentially set. And so there are three essential messages, I think, that boundaries communicate when you set them. One message is, I value our relationship enough to protect it from potential harm, right? Two is, I trust you enough to be honest with me about my needs and limits. So I set a boundary and maybe you don't agree with it and it prompts a conversation and you say, hey, Jamye, that's kind of unreasonable. Like, no, I am not going to call you at 3 a.m. every Sunday morning just because that's when you're in your flow state and you want to have conversation, right? So it's, I trust you enough. I'm telling you this so we can have a conversation. And then three, I respect both of us enough to create conditions where we can thrive together. So those are really the three essential things or messages that setting boundaries can communicate, particularly in the workplace. You know, boundaries really help us navigate like different working styles, different personality styles, communication preferences, capacity. Um, when I know your boundaries, I can engage with you authentically rather than just like walking on eggshells. Like I often have observed this where boundaries have not been set and there's this uncomfortable interactions between colleagues, and those uncomfortable interactions could easily be quelled with just like a conversation. Hey, when you use the phrase, this is an example, like if you use the phrase, um, I expect you to have this done by XYZ, like that triggers me because I feel like that phrase tells me you don't trust me, right? And the way that I communicate usually is um, articulating, here's when uh, these things need to be complete, or these tasks need to be complete. It's all on the work plan or the schedule, the Gantt chart or whatever. Let me know if you need my assistance in any way. And if you're comfortable with it, right? Like, or I need you to send me updates every 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? And my point is right, like those relationships, if that conversation doesn't happen, now every time we talk or every time those folks talk in that phrase or that communication style is continuously communicated to the person who doesn't receive it well, now that person is feeling anxiety. They're feeling, like I said, walking out eggshells. And so boundaries really create like clarity around safety, and safety allows for deeper connection. Boundaries also prevent burnout and resentment, which are two major barriers to connection. When I honor my limits, I bring my best self to relationships rather than a depleted, resentful version of myself. And we kind of talked about that earlier with the forgiveness piece. And then the other, just last thing I'll mention is like the art of boundary setting isn't about building walls. I think that's what I want your listeners to remember most. It's about defining the conditions under which everyone can flourish. It's saying, like, this is what I need to show up fully in this relationship, which is ultimately like an act of generosity and kindness. It's not an act of withdrawal. It's an act of vulnerability. It's an act of openness. It's an act of trust. It's an act of humility. Um, and so that's how I view boundaries in the workplace.
Man, I love it. Yeah, it all goes to like what conditions would allow this relationship to thrive.
Exactly.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it makes me think about lots of boundaries. I feel like I was raised to view boundaries as like, this is what's needed to keep the peace or to keep things from getting too upset or whatever. This is a much more like thriving orientation rather than like a surviving orientation towards boundaries.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess finally you talk about this like me to we, this evolve your we is your book name, which is a very cool name. It's like it's simple, it's easy to understand, and it's unique and innovative. It's got a take to it that feels different than it feels like it's in your control, like what kind of we or team you're building or optimizing for.
Absolutely.
I like that. It kind of speaks to the possibility of your own agency as a leader to make your we however you need it to be. And you can start from where you're at now. It's not like some gap that's impossible to traverse.
Yes.
How does this connect with like, what does this evolution look like in real time within a business or a family system? And then how does this connect with your core philosophy?
So you hit it right on the head. Involving your we or our we really happens in distinct phases that organizations, families, individuals, they all move through, though they rarely move through it in a linear fashion. And the methodology, the arrived framework that is in the book really goes through those phases and helps you parse out how, where, when those things are applicable. So the first phase is the awareness, which is recognizing our perception of inadequacy in others and how our context shapes our reality.
Mm-hmm.
In business, this could look like leadership acknowledging historical harms or teams identifying patterns of exclusion in their organizational culture. After that awareness, right, like that self-awareness, next is the recognition and reconnaissance, and this is the arrive, so ARR. Next, recognition and reconnaissance, and that's mapping where empathy gaps exist and engaging in like earnest conversation across those gaps. So when you see or recognize that there we are behaving in ways where our social context has conditioned us to behave rather than how we want to behave, that's where that empathy mapping happens. I call that empathy, those empathy gaps where those gaps exist, and then engaging in earnest conversation across those gaps. So this could involve bringing in people, having those conversations kind of that we talked about earlier to the table and creating honest dialogue about experiences. And then there's investigation, which digs deeper in examining not just like the symptoms, but the root causes of disconnections. Organizations might analyze like policies or practices and power structures. And I think they do this all the time, but within this structure, as we are evolving our me to we, or changing what our or evolving what our current we is, we look at the policies and practices and structures to understand how they might be perpetuating division within our organization, or perpetuating stagnation, or perpetuating exclusivity rather than inclusivity, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then visualization helps us articulate, and we talked about the creativity piece, right? It helps us articulate what a more connected future would look like. Having the ability, now that you've had those hard conversations through awareness and recognition and reconnaissance, you kind of dug deeper to do the root cause analysis. Now you're kind of set up for having like this inclusive conversation of, okay, what does the future look like if all of us are included in the we? And then engineering and enactment is turning that vision into concrete action. So strategic planning, what have you. And then finally, in the arrived method, is deliberation, and that involves reflection. So you talked about it earlier, which I think you were just so spot on about having the space and time to process things and being able to, one, admit where awareness, recognition, reconnaissance of where there something that we missed in that, like we've done all the work but we still have problems, like really being honest and transparent about the results of any kind of strategic plan that you put together to evolve your weave. And I think like what's beautiful about the evolution is that at least with this framework, it happens both individually and collectively. And you hit it on the head, right? Like it starts with that individual, and it starts with that individual from where they are, right? It doesn't matter if you have like this enlightened understanding of relationships and forgiveness and all of those things. It really starts from where you are, and each person can then really expand their capacity for empathy and connection.
Mm.
And the entire system shifts once that happens. When each person in your organization like has this focus on it, their capacity for empathy, the entire system shifts. That's how you get from like this macro level or micro level in interpersonal to like this macro level systemic change. And I really believe, finally, sorry, I'm being a little bit long-winded, but like these like smaller acts of courage, when people like even in a small way engage in empathy, they just create ripple effects that gradually transform culture. Like people recognize it, they see it, they notice it. They may not even be comfortable right away, but as it's happening over time, they realize like, hey, no, my organization actually really cares about how I feel, how I show up, whether I can be me. And eventually they will get to that place where now they are being courageous and being vulnerable, being open. And that just supercharges organizations because you're getting people on the same page in alignment from an intrinsic perspective, not just from this extrinsic, we're going to accumulate wealth or we're going to accumulate materials or we're going to accumulate prestige, but from a more human intrinsic value perspective. And I think at the end of the day, that's the most powerful form of motivation that any human being can have.
Wow, that's really good stuff. That ripple effect is absolutely huge. I think about that a lot. It's sometimes you get overwhelmed by all the things that you need change in the world, but then you just go back to how can I create a ripple of the change that I want to see in the world?
Mm-hmm.
How can I lead with that and create that and generate that, source that from within me, and be the source for that change systemically?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
man.
What's a daily practice that a leader can do to lead more from their heart without losing focus on the results?
We oftentimes ask people like how they're doing. And I think you mentioned this about new baby, right? Like, how's the baby doing? Then you gotta move on. But I recommend what I call like intentional connection, which is like a 5-minute practice at the beginning of each day where you identify one person you want to connect with authentically. And it's not like scheduling a meeting or discussing deliverables, but like really as a leader, intentionally creating space to see and be seen by another human being. And that means inviting genuine sharing of experiences, like questions like, what energizes you these days? Or like, what's been challenging about the project beyond the technical aspects, right? So you're digging more beyond operational and more into like interpersonal. And then like having asked these questions or listened to questions or told your kind of rendition of the answers to those questions, really listening with full attention without like planning for your response or solution, and really analyzing from that perspective of neutrality, where that person is coming from, how their social context is shaping those things, and really building those explanatory power muscles. And I think this practice, it doesn't require like hours of time. It's really like people are going to see that you're genuine and authentic. And I tell people all the time, leaders all the time, there is no perfect way. There, we're not going to get it right all the time. We're not going to say the right things all the time. But people really respect honesty and genuine and authenticity more than they respect you saying the right thing. When they know that they can have that conversation with you and have it be transparent and honest. If there's something that they find off-putting or offensive, like you've already set the space for them to be able to tell you, right? And have that clear, transparent communication and relationship. So I think far from distracting from results, like those moments of connection create the psychological safety and the trust that really drive performance. People work harder for leaders who see their humanity.
Yeah.
Right. If I know you see me, that you believe in me, that you trust me, that our connection goes beyond like what I can do for you, I'm gonna work harder for you. That's how human beings work. Yeah, and when problems surface, we feel safe about sharing those challenges early, not like 5 months or 6 months or years down the line. No, we talk about it right now because you've already, as a leader, kind of set that momentum and that culture up for your organization. And right, like the beauty of the practice is just it's simple. 5 minutes, genuine conversation, transform a relationship, and transform relationships, transform organizations.
Yeah, man. Your work is very visionary. It's grounding. If you could leave the listeners with any invitation or call to action, what would that be?
My invitation is simple, but it's challenging. And I've done this, and I continue to do it. It's hard, but I would choose a relationship if I was gonna present a call to action for your listeners. Choose one relationship where you perceive that another person is inadequate in some way, and then so maybe they've harmed you, maybe you don't like the way they talk or they present themselves, or you think they're arrogant or what have you. But choose that person and commit to crossing the boundary of that inadequacy with curiosity instead of judgment. This could be a colleague whose communication style frustrates you, a family member whose political views seem incomprehensible, or even like community group, or the HOA association or something like this, right? Just approaching that relationship with the assumption that there is explanatory power to be gained, that understanding why they see the world as they do will enrich your own perspective, even if you still disagree, right? That's the challenge I would submit to your listeners in the call to action.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And where can we find you online? How can our listeners follow your work or get a copy of your book?
Sure. You can go to my website, evolveyourwe.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jamye Chapman. And yeah, sign up for the newsletter, sign up to the website, reach out. There's ways to talk to me one-on-one. I do one-on-one coaching. I do executive leadership coaching. I do seminars, workshops with organizations. So yeah, reach out, read the book, and hopefully I'll see some of your listeners. And I'd love to come back on the show again as well, hopefully at some point in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, you've been a really beautiful presence today on the show. I think people are going to get a lot out of this. I really
Thank you.
genuinely hope they connect with you and you can begin working with certain people.
Right on. Thank you so much. It's been great.